Hello, everyone. We're very happy to welcome you at the next online event of Yiddishland Pavilion. Today, our event is a talk with Jeffrey Shandler. We're very happy to be welcoming him here today. And he's going to be talking about imagining Yiddishland. And I think this imagining Yiddishland, this has been the process that Evgeny Fix and myself have been doing for the past few months as a part of our project Yiddishland Pavilion that I briefly want to tell you about, maybe for those who haven't yet seen our project or heard much about it. So Yiddishland Pavilion is an intervention into this year's Venice Biennale, into the 59th Venice Biennale. And it's representation of Yiddishland in Venice this year. So we dared to land Yiddishland Pavilion on the context and on the territory of the Biennale in Venice, and just think of how Yiddishland could potentially be presented in the global art scene and one of the biggest art events in the world, and how it can integrate itself into this pretty rigid, pretty boundary-based environment. So Yiddishland Pavilion is a hybrid project that's taking place both online and offline. Online in the form of various projects, online events like this event that we're all taking part in today, and offline in the form of this various interventions scattered all over the Biennale. Right now, you can see two projects there, see and experience, I would say. So one of them is the project by Evgeny Fix. It's an audio walk through 8 national pavilions, and it's a project based on the story of Yoni Fine, a modernist artist who spent quite a lot of years in exile. He was born in Ukraine. He had to flee to Lithuania and then Poland. So all of his life and this narrative is constructed from both factual and fictional facts and sort of projections. So you can hear each chapter in respective pavilion, and this is how you make your route through the Biennale, quite in an unusual way, because through this route you start in Arsenale, then you start in Giardini, then you find yourself outside of the Biennale premises of the Lithuanian pavilion, then you go back to Giardini, and then there are a few pavilions in Arsenale and so on. So the walk also offers quite a new way of looking at the Biennale itself, at its geography and at its locations. And another project that you can see also and experience in Venice right now is a project by Ella Punzowski-Bergelsen and Anna Elena Torres. And they together created an augmented reality sculpture that, by the way, can be experienced from anywhere if you have a phone, but it can also be experienced in the German pavilion as a reminder about Jewish history, Yiddish history in Germany, kind of lending upon the architecture of German pavilion. And besides that, there are quite a few projects. Some of them are existing work, some of them have been commissioned specifically for the project, some of them have been adapted for the online format. So here's a list of all the projects created by contributors of Yiddishland Pavilion this year. And in the section of events, you can also see our current, future, and previous events, with some of them being held in Venice in April. So we had a discussion in the Latvian pavilion, about Jewish art in exile, Latvian art in exile, contemporary Ukrainian art in exile. There was a performance of collective called New Yiddish Kunst that took place in Arsenale. And another thing that we also had, and was, I think, a beautiful gesture of self-expression and solidarity and fun, was Yiddish dance that was led by Avia Moore, artistic director of Class Canada. So this is, Yiddishland Pavilion in short. We have a very extensive online program this year, and today's event is a part of it. And I will kindly ask Zhenya, my curatorial partner in this project, to introduce our event and our speaker.
Thank you so much, Masha. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our next speaker, our today's speaker. Jeffrey Shandler is Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at Rutgers University. He received a PhD in Yiddish Studies from Columbia University. Shandler has been a visiting scholar at the Andrea and Charles Bronfman Center at Tel Aviv University, the Center for Religion and Media, New York University, the Jewish Studies Program, University of California, Berkeley, the University of South California, Shoah Foundation, the Center for Jewish Studies, Harvard University, the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, University of Pennsylvania, and the Center for Jewish History, New York. Jeffrey Shandler is the author of the following books: While America Watches, Televising the Holocaust, from Oxford University Press; Adventures in Yiddishland, Postvernacular Language and Culture, University of California Press; A Study of Contemporary Yiddish Culture; Jews, God and Videotape, Religion and Media in America, New York University Press, which analyzes the impact of new communication technologies and media practices on American Jews' religious life; Shtetl, A Vernacular Intellectual History, Rutgers University Press, an examination of how Jewish life in Eastern Europe provincial towns has become the subject of extensive memory, creativity, and scholarships; Holocaust Memory in the Digital Age, Survivor Stories and New Media Practices, Stanford University Press, which explores memory practices in the largest online archive of video interviews with Holocaust survivors; and a more recent book, Yiddish, Biography of a Language, that came out just a couple of years ago from Oxford University Press. Jeffrey Shandler translations of Yiddish literature include Mani Leib's children's classic Yingel Singel Chvat and Emil, and Karl, a Holocaust novel for young leaders by Yankev Gladstein. Jeffrey Shandler has curated exhibitions for the Jewish Museum of New York, the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia, and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. The titles of today's talk by Jeffrey Shandler is Imagining Yiddishland. What does it mean to conjure a place for Yiddish language that has never stood alone, that has always been spoken by minority population, usually without official recognition throughout an international diaspora? How have writers, artists, and others conceived of Yiddish as having indigeneity, territoriality, or nationality? And without further ado, Jeffrey, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Evgeny and Maria, for inviting me to be part of the first Yiddishland Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, and I'm told that plans are already starting to take shape for the next one, which is great news. And I want to thank everyone for joining me. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. And I would now like to share my screen. And I hope we're in business. Good, I see nods. Great, thank you. So we're here at the Yiddishland Pavilion of the 2022 Venice Biennale. But just exactly where are we? And moreover, just where is Yiddishland? The name Yiddishland implies a geographic location, but of course it's not a place you will find on any conventional map of the world. How then has this land been identified, described, depicted, or imagined? As what I will present today will demonstrate, there's a wide range of ways of characterizing Yiddishland with what it is or was or might be. All of these efforts reveal assumptions about the relationship of a location, however it might be conceived, to the Yiddish language, which, as Yevgeny stated just a few minutes ago, this is a language that has never stood alone. Its speakers have always had some command of at least one other language, and it's a language that has always been spoken by a minority population, often without official recognition, throughout an international diaspora. So the meaning of the term Yiddishland might seem self-evident, but at the same time, it has significant connotations. The term resonates with a productive idiom in the Yiddish language, an epis von Episland, which means, this is according to Uriel Weinreich's Modern English Yiddish, Yiddish English Dictionary, a genuine, excellent, or outstanding something. So Weinreich offers the example, a Kuchen von Kuchenland, which is literally a cake from cake land, but it means an excellent cake. Following this model, the phrase Yiddish von Yiddishland would mean genuine Yiddish, or perhaps the epitome of Yiddish, Yiddish at its best, implying that Yiddishland is the ideal locus for Yiddish, a Yiddish utopia. Examples of the use of this term Yiddishland are noteworthy, not only in their quantity, but also their variety, and moreover, the range of implications inherent in their use. What does it mean, for instance, when literature scholar Benjamin Harshav wrote of early 20th century American Yiddish poets, who we see here, that for them, literature was everything. It was a substitute for religion and statehood. It was a state in itself, Yiddishland. Or when the film critic Jim Hoberman described Yiddish film as not just a national cinema without a nation state, but a national cinema that with every presentation created its own ephemeral nation state, a Yiddishland. Or when Avram Berg, chair of the Educational Committee of the Knesset, stated as part of the Israeli legislature's homage to Yiddish, this was in 1993, he explained that such terms used by Israeli Hebrew speakers as schwitzer, which means show off, or kumsitz, which means get together, these are words that have come from Yiddishland. What's the significance of the Yiddishland Cafe at the Workman's Circle in Toronto, or of a recording label for Yiddish songs called Yiddishland Records, or of an email appeal from the Yiddishist organization Jugendruf to make reservations for its annual end-of-summer retreat in the countryside, Kedei zu wohnen in Yiddishland auf der Woche, in order to live in Yiddishland for the week. Beyond these recent examples, the notion of Yiddishland has been discussed in the language for a little over a century. The pioneering champion of secular Yiddishism, Chaim Zetlovsky, offered some of the earliest published evocations of Yiddishland with a vision rooted in the language's geopolitical implications. In his 1913 essay, in a Yiddish Medina, which could be rendered in English as either in a Jewish nation or in a Yiddish nation, Zetlovsky characterizes the time and place of his childhood as a model of Jewish cultural and socioeconomic autonomy centered on the Yiddish language. He wrote, I spent my childhood years in a rein Yiddischer Zwiva, in a purely Jewish or Yiddish environment. Had I not known that in theory, we Jews lived in diaspora, And had I been asked to characterize my life's experience as they appeared at first glance, I would then have had a right to say that I live in a Yiddishland, a Jewish country or a Yiddish country. For there was so little sense of exile in our region of Belarusia in the years between 1865 and the end of the 1870s that it seemed as though we Jews did not live in exile among the Russians, but perhaps quite the opposite, that the Russians with whom we interacted lived in exile among us in unser eigen Yiddish Land, in our own Jewish or Yiddish country. We Jews were the ruling people, if not in the political sense, then at least in the economic, national, and cultural sense. Many of the non-Jews with whom we dealt spoke the ruling language of the land, Yiddish, and in fact, quite a fine Yiddish spiced with appropriate idioms. So here Szydłowski roots his notion of Yiddishland in a very specific historical and geographic setting. It serves as a model for envisioning the potential of Yiddish in other times and places to be the basis of an autonomous Jewish cultural community with the attributes, if not the sovereign status, of nationhood. So strategic to Szydłowski's conceptualization of Yiddishland, as we see from this text, is his use of the term Yiddish, which can refer to both the Yiddish language and the Jewish people. This is undone in English and in other languages that distinguish between Yiddish and Jewish. But for Szydłowski, the dual meaning of the word Yiddish epitomizes the power of language to realize Jewish sovereignty in the face of the widespread perception of Jews as a people without a land. Indeed, a particular challenge of imagining Yiddishland is the question of how one might either situate it in some geographically specific location or envision an alternative notion of its spatiality. The term Yiddishland is sometimes used, as we see here, to refer to the region of Eastern Europe where a large population of the language's native speakers resided before World War II. It may also be used to describe a place beyond Eastern Europe where Yiddish speakers have lived in significant numbers. These locales include official sites, exemplified by Biarbazhan, the Soviet Union's Jewish autonomous region, formerly established in Eastern Siberia on the Manchurian border in 1934. And here we see the train station of Biarbazhan with its name in both Russian and Yiddish on the sign. But other locales can also be identified as Yiddishlands, such as urban immigrant enclaves of the earliest 20th century in New York, as we see here, or London or Paris or other cities. Plans to create official Yiddish-speaking regions include the unrealized efforts of Jewish territorialists during the first decades of the 20th century to establish a state for Yiddish speakers in various locations. Among these is the Kimberley, a region of northwestern Australia. And here, this is the Toronto-based artist Melissa Schiff's imaginative envision of what a Yiddishland in Kimberley might look like. More recently, Yiddish California, a secular Yiddish cultural organization, has announced aspirations to create a mixed usage community on a site in La Jolla. And this is a rendering of what that community would look like. The proposed site will provide what the organization describes as an immersive, shtetl-inspired, multi-generational community for Yiddish and non-Yiddish speakers alike. Other efforts to create places for Yiddish speakers have already been brought to fruition. This is exemplified by Yiddish Farm, founded in the year 2011 in upstate New York. It was created to expand the role of the Yiddish language, serve as a bridge between Yiddish speakers of various backgrounds, and promote environmental stewardship through organic farming. In addition, there are symbolic Yiddish lands, such as the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, and temporary Yiddish lands in the form of Yiddishist summer camps and contemporary Yiddish cultural festivals. Yiddish lands are not only created by Jewish political movements or by secular cultural activists. Consider Handel Ehrlich, a Yiddish language children's board game sold in Hasidic communities in Brooklyn, Montreal, and Jerusalem. The board of Handel Ehrlich means deal honestly, mimics the layout of the popular American board game Monopoly. Players, as in Monopoly, acquire real estate, they charge rent for the little plastic hotels and houses, and as they do so, they also learn lessons in moral conduct. For example, players must tithe all income from renting out their properties to provide support for yeshiva students. The game's instruction booklet explains, in Yiddish of course, that it will implant in children good character and reverence for God. Whoever deals honestly will have much success. And whereas other imitations of Monopoly replaced the streets of Atlantic City in the original version with those of New York or Chicago or some other city, Handel Ehrlich enables players to imagine inhabiting an international roster of sites of Hasidic settlement, both in the past, such as Krakow, Lezhansk, Lublin, and in the present, Antwerp, Borough Park, Montreal. As players of Handel Ehrlich make their way around the game's board, they leap across continents and travel through time in a Hasidic Yiddishland. Before World War II, perhaps the most widely encountered manifestations of Yiddishland were found on the printed page and in the minds of an extensive, widely scattered Yiddish readership. Visions of Yiddishland are elaborated most extensively and imaginatively in poetry. Yiddish poems about the Yiddish language, which is a remarkably extensive genre of modern Yiddish literature, frequently employ territorial images of Yiddish, whether explicitly or implicitly identified as Yiddishland. Consider, for example, the imagery in Aleph Almi's 1930 poem titled Yiddish. It begins an empire of scattered, beautifully blossoming islands. Its playful streams and rivers course through the great oceans, and it continues with a tour of the international Yiddish-speaking world. Along the Vistula, along the Dniester and the Dnieper, along the Thames, the Hudson, Mississippi, on the plateau, in the chain of the proud Andes, in Siberia and the splendid Caucasus, in the tropical heat of Africa, and in Rio de Janeiro, in Mexico, in Cuba and Canada, Yiddish makes the rockiest soil bear fruit. Other poets writing in the interwar years offered similar visions of Yiddishland by chronicling its centuries-old history or inventorying its international diaspora. They championed the tenacity of the language and implicitly of its speakers in the wake of then recent decades of upheaval and in the face of looming danger in its European heartland. Similar poetic Yiddishlands continued to appear for a time even after World War II. Such is the case of one of the most elaborate poems about Yiddish in Yiddish, and that is Leon Feinberg's cycle of 50 poems, again titled Yiddish. Feinberg in this cycle praises what he calls this language of languages as he chronicles its literary riches from the 16th century Venetian poet Elia Bocher to Avram Sutzkever, who would then soon become the doyen of Yiddish literature in Israel. On the cover of this work, published in New York in 1950, the title word Yiddish appears superimposed on a map of the world, as you see here, on which various cities are identified, including Montreal, Mexico City, Kiev, and Warsaw. And beneath the map appears the following verse. From Vilna to Buenos Aires, from Tel Aviv to New York, the miracle of generations has spread the kingdom of the Yiddish word. Feinberg's very boosterish poem notwithstanding, imagining Yiddishland has become a very different sort of cultural exercise in the post-World War II era. Before the war, notions of Yiddishland were tied, whether directly or indirectly, to the existence of an extensive and thriving speech community centered in Eastern Europe. Despite the upheavals of mass immigration and war and revolution and the demands of modernity, this continued to be a place that millions of Yiddish-speaking Jews called home, having done so for generations. After the Holocaust, examples of Yiddishland become exercises in imagining a community in the absence of its centuries-old East European center, and sometimes in the absence of Yiddish speakers as well. These examples constitute a new order of cultural endeavor. They chart the range and dynamics of what Yiddish has come to signify in Jewish life after the Holocaust, as they demonstrate both the strengths and the limitations of this exercise in the imaginary. An especially productive means of conceptualizing Yiddish in geographic terms in the post-World War II era is through mapping. Two different kinds of projects begun in the early post-war years offer complementary geographic visions of Yiddishland. First are maps of individual towns that appear in hundreds of Yiskerbücher. These are collaboratively produced memorial books, most of them written entirely or in part in Yiddish, which document Jewish life before the war in individual East European communities. These volumes began to be produced in large numbers by immigrants and survivors from these communities during the years after World War II. While these maps vary considerably in appearance, as you can see here, they are almost all drawn entirely from memory. Moreover, they all chart local Jewish geography. They prominently indicate its landmarks, synagogues, schools, bathhouses, kosher slaughterhouses, and the like, some of which might never appear on an official municipal map of the same locality. Some of these Yizker book maps, such as this one, also give the names, the Yiddish names that were used for streets and other geographic features, which often differ from their official names. These maps, frequently reproduced on the end papers of Yiskerbücher, place the enclosed written memories within the frame of an implicit, localized Yiddishland. The other post-war mapping endeavor is the Language and Cultural Atlas of Ashkenazic Jewry, which was initiated by Oriel Weinreich at Columbia University in the late 1950s. The atlas envisions Yiddishland on a grand scale. For this project, hundreds of native speakers of Yiddish, each hailing from a different location across Northern Europe, were interviewed extensively about their local language. So each dot that you see on this map of Northern Europe, that represents the location of an individual interviewee. The data that was amassed for this project yielded maps demonstrating that Yiddish dialects divided this Yiddish land into regions, the equivalent of provinces, their borders defined by differences in vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar. The central intellectual goal of the atlas is to demonstrate the historical substructure of modern European Yiddish dialects. But the project also makes an important symbolic statement about the territoriality of Yiddish. The atlas gives Yiddishland an impressive geographic measure, characterized as eventually coming to occupy a European area second in size only to the Russian one. In addition, the atlas situates the language's diaspora as strategic to understanding the interrelation of Yiddish-speaking Jews with their European neighbors across the dimensions of time and space. In the wake of the Holocaust, these two different mapping projects offer reminders of the geographic presence of millions of Yiddish-speaking Jews throughout pre-war Europe. Moreover, they provide means of envisioning World War II Yiddish lands, pre-World War II Yiddish lands on a local and a continental scale. Recent efforts to map the use of Yiddish extend beyond Northern Europe. World maps document the location and estimated number of Yiddish speakers in different countries today. This map tweaks the geographic boundaries of nations and continents to reflect the size of Yiddish speech communities. The larger the number of speakers in a given country, the larger its landmass appears. More localized maps of language use in major cities in England and the United States identify neighborhoods where different languages other than English are spoken. In London, Yiddish is present in Stamford Hill in the borough of Hackney. And in New York, Yiddish appears in Williamsburg and Borough Park in the borough of Brooklyn. And these are in both cities neighborhoods with large populations of Hasidim. Even as they strive to provide a sense of where one finds contemporary use of Yiddish, both the global and the urban maps render the location of Yiddish speech in territorial representations that distort a sense of its actual use. Speaking Yiddish is a highly localized phenomenon, and not only within nations, even in neighborhoods where Yiddish is used, its speakers overlap with other speech communities. For example, Williamsburg in Brooklyn has, in addition to a large Hasidic population, many native speakers of Spanish. And the Hasidim there also speak English, and many of them also speak Hungarian. A different image of situating Yiddish language use in geography appears on this map. It's one of a series documenting the use of individual Yiddish words, in this case, chutzpah, in North America. Occurrences of this Yiddish word in Twitter postings, the source of data for creating this map, largely correspond to major urban population centers in the United States, especially along both its coasts and in Canada. These are also where most Jews reside in these countries. But the map documents use of one Yiddish word embedded in tweets that were likely largely otherwise in English. The authors of these posts are not necessarily fluent in Yiddish, not necessarily Jews. Rather, they are familiar with this and perhaps a few other Yiddish words. This map poses a larger question. Does the documented use of a single Yiddish word embedded within another language constitute a manifestation of Yiddishland? Aside from indicating actual sites of language use, maps are also employed to conjure imaginary Yiddish lands. For example, this rendering of a non-existent Jewish People's Republic, described as a Marxist-Leninist socialist republic ostensibly founded in 1951, located in a territory between the German Democratic Republic and Poland, whose official language is Yiddish. And of course, this place never existed. Maps can also Yiddishize familiar places through translation, such as this vintage map of the United States, which lists each state's name and main products, or this map of Middle Earth, created for a Yiddish rendering of J.R.R. Tolkien's novel, The Hobbit. These maps intimate that any geography might become a Yiddish land by dint of the presence of the language. Ultimately, all these maps pose a challenge to locating Yiddish land, as they are all tied to existing geographies, be it neighborhoods or cities or nations or continents, or to imagined territories, whether in Middle Europe or Middle Earth. Depicting a territory occupied solely and continuously by Yiddish speakers projects images of Yiddish land as a place where everyone communicates in a single language. This is a model that appears frequently, if implicitly, in maps of the languages of the world, such as this one, which does not include Yiddish, among many, many, many other languages. And it reflects many countries' ideals of a national monolingual culture exemplified by an official language. However, this image does not reflect actual language used in most places around the world. Speakers of different languages not only live side by side within a single country or even a neighborhood, but many individuals use more than one language in the course of their daily lives. Yiddish exemplifies this phenomenon, as its speakers have always been in contact with speakers of other languages. Indeed, like other diaspora Jewish languages, it was forged as a result of this contact. Moreover, Yiddish speakers have always had some command of at least one other language, often more than one. Imagining Yiddish land as a territory of whatever size, exclusively populated by speakers of Yiddish who know no other language, may be a compelling notion, but it is far from the reality of Yiddish language use, past or present. And I would argue it is a false friend in conceptualizing a place for Yiddish. Consider a very different model of Yiddish land that was advocated, if implicitly, during the first decades of the 20th century by some modern Jewish political movements. They embraced the diaspora rather than repudiating it, and they championed the power of Yiddish to realize a virtual homeland for its speakers, irrespective of national borders. Diaspora nationalist parties, such as the Jewish Labor Bund, which produced this election poster, and the Volkspartei, championed the principle of Doigkeit. This is a Yiddish word meaning here-ness, meaning the right of the value of Jews to live here, that is, wherever they find themselves, as citizens of their respective countries and as Jews. In its very articulation, Doigkeit implies a Yiddishland. By proclaiming a speaker's location as a site where Yiddish can flourish, Doigkeit renders any place, however provisionally, as part of a Yiddishland. In this respect, Yiddishland is a performative phenomenon. It is summoned into existence by speech, suggesting that the place Yiddish and its speakers inhabit is both highly adaptable and highly mutable. The concept of Doigkeit can inform thinking about the possibilities of Yiddishland in the present. And it reminds me of something I heard a number of years ago from a student who had been studying Yiddish in New York. The student defined Yiddishland as a place that comes into existence whenever two or more people speak Yiddish. And this definition of Yiddishland has provocative implications. If it's a place defined by the use of the language, then does Yiddishland appear during a conversation, but then disappear during pauses and interruptions? What is the status of Yiddishland in a conversation in which one party speaks Yiddish and the other responds in a different language? Is some sort of speech community, even a community of two, required? Or does talking to oneself in Yiddish constitute Yiddishland? What about thinking or dreaming in Yiddish? And does the presence of the Yiddish printed word in a library, on a sign, or at a newsstand, do these constitute a Yiddishland? Rather than imagining Yiddishland in territorial terms, we might better conceive of it as existing in a form of a network, consisting of individuals or communities, sometimes located far from one another, connected through their shared use of Yiddish. And therefore, as a locus defined by language rather than landscape, Yiddish would seem to have a special affinity for the internet, which facilitates the creation of virtual spaces, pages, sites, platforms, or here the Yiddish Wikipedia, for the purpose of presenting, disseminating, and linking people through various forms of communication. Indeed, compared to efforts to provide Yiddish with its own turf, the internet appears to offer the most expansive approach to conceptualizing a place for Yiddish. Online Yiddish periodicals, radio programs, blogs, podcasts, and videos circulate internationally, enabling the distribution of mass media and personal writing in the language with unprecedented facility. The internet enables learning Yiddish by providing dictionaries and other resources, including instructional media and interactive online classes. Social media platforms foster virtual communion among disparate individual Yiddish speakers and groups of cultural activists. But at the same time that the internet seems to let Yiddish be anywhere, the medium can do so by loosening the language's connections to actual people in particular locations. Indeed, the internet reveals its own limits for facilitating the principle of Doigkeit. Much of what is posted on Yiddish websites and social media promotes live encounters, such as concerts, plays, conferences, lectures, workshops, courses, rather than serving solely to create online engagements that are complete in themselves. Indeed, the internet highlights the importance, and in some places, the scarcity of face-to-face contact in the Yiddish-speaking world. So even as Yiddishland is defined by language, its existence ultimately entails something else as well, the familiar, intimate, social encounter that has long been associated with speaking Yiddish. In every location, past or present, physical or virtual, real or imaginary, in which a place for Yiddish has been sought or conjured, the effort does not yield simple or stable results. And this reflects the challenge of conceptualizing something as evanescent and dynamic as a language as occupying a place of its own. This challenge has become more challenging and more compelling in the wake of the Holocaust. The new values ascribed to Yiddish in all the imaginings of Yiddishland in the post-World War II era entail a break in continuity with pre-war environments in Eastern Europe where Yiddish served as a widely used vernacular. At the same time, post-war Yiddish lands continue the process of rethinking the value of the language that has been a hallmark of modern Ashkenazic Jewish life. Uniting all these imaginary projects is a cultural yearning or dissatisfaction of some kind, desires to see Jewish life transformed, whether politically or religiously or socially or artistically. These are projected onto the language and onto its potential for symbolic meaning. The proliferation of Yiddishlands now being written, performed, displayed, and otherwise imagined by people around the world testifies to the power of this language as a symbolic force in Jewish culture in the post-Holocaust era. Loose from its pre-war geographic, demographic, and cultural moorings, the Yiddish language acquires a new symbolic significance even as its primary value as a vernacular is in decline. How can these wide-ranging tendencies be sustained simultaneously? And what are the limitations of their range, even in as elastic a concept as Yiddishland? And finally, why is the notion of imagining Yiddishland so attractive, especially now, and for such a diverse range of individuals and communities? Perhaps the answer lies in the way that Yiddishland embodies contradictory impulses, capable of embodying progressivism as well as retrospection, appealing to the traditionally observant as well as the ardently secular. Moreover, at the same time that these exercises elevate Yiddish to a sovereign status, they flout the notion of nationhood itself. And perhaps this is why, for those who have not made the imaginative leaps that it demands, Yiddishland can seem quixotic, for part of its appeal is precisely its unrealness. But failing to appreciate the value inherent in conjuring Yiddishland is to discount the vital role that the imagination can play in modern Jewish culture, especially its ability to redress extensive rupture, displacement, and loss with liberating possibilities for cultural creativity going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. So I hope Masha is with us.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just left. I needed to close the door. There's horrible noise outside. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. It's been amazing, very interesting how you, wrapped it in a very sharp presentation. It's a huge world that's hard to embrace, but I think you've done a great and very interesting work on it. Before we have some questions from the audience, I, by the way, encourage everyone to type their questions in the chat. I wanted to talk and ask you a little bit about identity. Because you were talking a lot about imagined Yiddishland, imaginary community, imagined community. How would you describe, and can we speak about Yiddish identity, and how can we differentiate it from, let's say, Jewish identity? Is it just based on speaking the language, knowing the language, or there are some other mechanisms that constitute this identity and the sense of belonging to this imagined community?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. I have to begin by confessing is that identity is a word I tend to avoid using in my own work because it's very challenging in terms of what can be meant by it. And I would say that what I would focus my intention on is actions involving Yiddish, because in part because it's just clearer to address them. Identity can be something that's very internal, cerebral, that's not so accessible, and how it gets attached to various phenomena. But actions they're manifest in a way that are really key. And one of the things that's interesting to me about Yiddish actions is that it can, on one hand, be wrapped up with some kind of larger sense of Jewishness, which might be religious, which might be political or cultural. It can also be embraced by people who aren't Jews and who see it as having a symbolic value in relation to their own culture. And what I'm thinking of in particular is in recent political action in Poland by Poles, not Jewish Poles, but people are ethnic Poles, that Yiddish gets used in productions of cultural protest. And the action of using Yiddish as a way to disrupt and disturb an imagined monolithic Poland where everybody is Slavic, everybody is Catholic, everybody's first language is Polish, to shake that up by using a language that that haunts the past of Poland, where in the pre-World War II Poland, 1/3 of the Polish Republic in the interwar years were Jews, the majority of them Yiddish speakers. So part of what's interesting is that this can be brought into various actions of realizing different kinds of Jewish life, but it can also be employed, as in that example, and there are others, of people who aren't Jews, but for whom the language has symbolic importance for their own culture.
Thank you. We have a question for Zhenya as well from Benjamin. I'll read it out loud. So would it be possible, Zhenya, what are your thoughts on the notion of Yiddishland? In particular, I'm thinking about your attempts to map spaces in Yiddish and also through other means, including translating, saying, from other minority languages into Yiddish. What does that mean for imagining Yiddishland?
Thank you. Thank you for this question. I did do a project in which I translated from minority languages of the Russian Federation, ethnic minority languages of the Russian Federation into Yiddish, but via Russian. And in this case, I guess Yiddishland would manifest itself as a place of solidarity, I guess, solidarity of speakers of minority languages in the context of the Russian Empire in this case. And as Jeffrey mentioned, the nature of Yiddishland, it's very contradictory, and that's what is also very thought-provoking and attractive. And in the case of this project that Benjamin mentioned, in which I translated, let's say, from Nagai into Yiddish via Russian, the imperial language, the language of the Russian Empire, the official language, had to be somewhere in the mix, right? And that's also kind of, I guess, was a contradictory and kind of problematic aspect of my project, because I couldn't translate directly from Nagai into Yiddish. I had to read, let's say, a translation of Nagai proverb in Russian, and then from Russian I would translate it into Yiddish. So from Nagai to Russian via, from Nagai to Yiddish via Russian.
Thank you, Benjamin, for your question. Jeffrey, I also wanted to ask you about maybe Uh, Political potential of Yiddishland. You spoke a lot about these communities that are being formed. You spoke about Yiddishland, California, which is like a shtetl-based community. I really like this image that you showed. When we talk about Yiddishland Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, we often think about, its political implication, of representing Yiddishland without, I think, kind of, an official permission maybe from the Biennale, right? Because this project is an absolutely guerrilla project. We just kind of landed it on the Biennale without asking anyone about whether we could do that or not. So, and I see lots of this kind of sporadic movements happening here and there, maybe as a response to current political and social institutes becoming more not obsolete. They're becoming not efficient. They don't really meet the demands and interests of many people. And can we talk about Yiddishland and these communities as some kind of strategy of creating your own political project, your own, project of political escape in a way? How would you respond to that?
Well, I think, there's very interesting to think about the difference between these pre-World War II ideas, whether it was territorialism or the Bundist idea of Deutschheit, where the language is being seen as foundational for some kind of political movement, whether it's establishing a territory where Yiddish speakers would be a majority population and would have a greater autonomy culturally, if not politically, than what they were facing in Europe. Or the Bundes, this idea of Deutschheit is that in a way you live in two places at once, because you live in whatever country you live in, and you live there as a Jew, and you have a right to that. And what establishes that is the fact that you would have Yiddish as your language of daily life, but of course you would also have the language of the country in which you're inhabiting as a citizen is sort of implicit in there, but would be essential, certainly if you think about, the Bund in pre-war Poland, where they had their greatest impact. And so those are two very different models of from the pre-war period of thinking about the language as a force for political change, but assuming this very large population of native speakers of the language. Today, what you will see are a turn to the language as an alternative voice and by smaller movements, and where the smallness and the unofficialness are part of the appeal, because that is that's very liberating. It's very limiting in some ways, but it's also very liberating. And I think that that work of using Yiddish, and often using it not as the vernacular, but as a language of symbolic value, what I would call post-vernacular use of the language. That's a different kind of engagement with the language. And I think that embracing it as precisely that it's alternative, that it's unofficial, that it's small, that's a virtue, not a problem. I think that's really key to understanding a number of projects of a political nature using Yiddish today. And I would include the Yiddishland Pavilion.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a question from Anita, and she She's asking the following. She says that your concept of post-vernacularity has been used by scholars researching other language communities, for instance, Scots, Pennsylvania Dutch, and Native American languages. Has any of the scholarship changed, challenged, or expanded your thinking about Yiddish post-vernacularity?
Thank you. It's a good question. I have to confess that I don't follow where it turns up as closely as I might. And I always, so like, I didn't know people who were writing about Scots were using post-vernacularity. So it's very interesting. What it is it's a model for a mode of language use in which the fact that you're using the language has value in its own right that is as important as whatever you're saying or writing or performing in the language. And of course, it assumes you have a choice of more than one language, and that the language you're choosing has this value that is different from the vernacular use. And it's especially, I think, apposite for languages that once had this vernacular status that now has people turning to it for this sort of symbolic value. The one thing that I have found interesting recently was talking to my colleague, the linguist Gilad Zuckerman, who is based at the University of Adelaide in Southern Australia. And he has been doing work with Aboriginal communities in Australia who are looking to keep their Aboriginal languages from disappearing. And that one of the things he has been doing is working as not only a scholar, but also an activist. So he has, for example, helped develop books that children can use to start to learn a language that was spoken by ancestors that they might not hear spoken at all, or spoken regularly, or spoken extensively. And one of the things he talks about with this community that I think is very valuable in thinking about all these kinds of post-vernacular engagements with language, he says, you go as far as you want to go. If you want to achieve fluency in the language, and make it the equivalent of, let's say, English in the case of Australia as the majority language, that's fine, but you don't have to do that. It's okay if you learn a couple of songs, learn a few familiar phrases, learn some basic vocabulary. Any engagement that you find satisfying is of value. And I found that very interesting to then bring back to Yiddish, where I think some people involved in Yiddish who are learning the language, not as a first language, but coming to it as a second language, feel a kind of pressure to have it be as comprehensive as the command of their first language. And that's challenging. I mean, that's challenging for learning any second language. And it's especially challenging in a language like Yiddish, where, as opposed to say, if you want to learn French as a second language, you can go to France, you can hang out there, you can learn a lot from observation and engaging people very readily. That's a much harder thing to do with learning Yiddish. And so taking the pressure off of that and saying, however far you go that's satisfying for you, that is a value. Don't discount that. For some people, it's, they're going to want the whole language. They're going to want to go full throttle, but that isn't necessarily the only way to engage a language in a post-vernacular mode that will be valuable and will be meaningful. And I think that's an important thing to think about, and especially as we look at some of the political uses of Yiddish today. That's the use of the language is very selective, but very charged with meaning.
Yeah, and I was especially interested in the example that you brought about Poland, how in Poland it's used now as a language of protest, highly politically charged. Could you maybe think of any other examples? And also, how Yiddish is being used maybe in the countries where, with a huge level of anti-Semitism, with, all the governmental actions being oppressive towards any manifestation of Jewish culture?
Well, you have, I mean, this is also, this is still in Poland, but it's, there's this foundation called the Borderland Foundation in the town of Sejny. And Sejny is on the border of Poland, Belarus, Russia, and Lithuania. It's that corner, northeastern corner of Poland. And they use their location to talk about the value of contact across borders, politically and culturally and linguistically. And this was a town, like many towns in Poland, that had a sizable population of Jews before World War II. Now there aren't any Jews there or near there, but they invoke the Yiddish past, the Yiddish-speaking past, through performance in particular, extensively as a kind of a way of talking about the importance of engaging people across cultural boundaries, in a way by saying, look what happens when that breaks down, so that the case of Yiddish becomes a cautionary tale. One might also think about, is very, very different, but the place of Yiddish in Israel as an alternative voice in various ways. And I think about a couple of years ago, the Israeli Hebrew writer Edgar Keret won a prize. I'm forgetting the name of the prize, but part of the prize is your book, which is written in Hebrew. They will translate into Arabic and one other language of your choice. And he chose Yiddish. And he said, I don't know Yiddish, but I think it is important to have this work in Yiddish as a way of sort of pushing back against aspects of contemporary Israeli Hebraic culture that need some troubling. So it turns up there as well. And of course, at each place, it's going to have a different valence, having to do with the circumstances in which Yiddish, what constellation of languages and cultures and issues it's being brought up in.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Israel is an interesting example. A few events before we had a panel about Yiddish theater, and one of the speakers were Duo Salamanca, and their performances, their artistic practice is based largely on Yiddish, which is quite revolutionary, I think, for contemporary Israel, but also a very important gesture politically and culturally and linguistically also, of course.
They do absolutely brilliant work around language, among other things, but their work around language and movement among languages with Yiddish in the mix is really just so sharp, so deftly done. And I'm so delighted to see that they were participants in your program. And of course, the work they presented on this great Yiddish comedy duo, Jigan and Schumacher, it really exemplifies in this early period of Israeli statehood of Yiddish as really pushing back against a lot of what was going on politically in Israel in the 50s and 60s. So I'm very glad that was part of your presentations.
Thank you. Yeah, we wanted them to have a bigger contribution. We were all discussing, building a sukkah in Giardini and Arsenale and have it for the entire duration of the Biennale. But this time it didn't happen. But who knows? Maybe next time
2024.
we can be more like it. Yes.
Biennale 2024. Sign them up.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. Absolutely. Does anyone have more questions or would like to also contribute something to this conversation?
I think I have one question for Jeffrey, if there are no more questions. Jeffrey, I'm wondering, about your thoughts on the value of art projects for Yiddishland, and whether you see, I mean, I see it, I'm not sure if you see it also, that if we distinguish between Yiddish culture and Yiddish art, I think for Yiddish art, post-war, the theme of Yiddishland became a big thing. So I'm wondering if you could speak about, so is engagement by artists with the topic of Yiddishland is a particular important for the issue of Yiddishland, for the concept of Yiddishland, or we should see artists in engagement with Yiddishland, with the type of Yiddishland, together with educational projects, scholarly work. Is there a special need for art projects for Yiddishland? Or so if you could share your thoughts about art and Yiddishland.
Okay, well, thank you for the question. I would say, one of the things in putting this talk together, since I was going to be doing this on Zoom, and I thought nobody wants to look at me for a half an hour, that I would use primarily visual examples, not only pre-war and post-war World War II examples. And what to me is interesting, we think of Yiddishland, we think, okay, well, it's about language. But one of the things I've learned from studying language is that whenever you talk about language, you're always talking about something else as well. And one of the things I find interesting about various art projects, including ones that have been part of the Biennale you've put together, is what is the relationship of language to the visual, which might be very narrowly defined. It could be a single word. It could be letters of the alphabet. It could be very, very small, but that doesn't mean it's not powerful. And I would say that in these kinds of works, we see a kind of effort to translate a culture understood as language-based into cultural practices that are visual. And this is not recent. When we think about illustrated Yiddish books, how illustration played a role in pushing ideas about the language, probably most strikingly in this brief period of Soviet avant-garde graphic design, where we see just really richly experimental work, not only with imagery, but with the actual words, with the alphabet, where revolutionary words and ideas are conjoined with revolutionary visual culture. So this has a considerable history in Yiddish culture, and I would say it's probably become more of a focus as the use of the language is less the full vernacular and more something that is more constrained, that we see the power of the visual coming to the fore in certainly projects that you were showing this year.
Thank you. Masha, are there any other questions?
Sorry, there are two more questions, one of the linguistic nature and one I think is going beyond culture and linguistic borders. I'll start with the second question and then we'll go back to the first. It's a question from Anna Torres, and she's asking the following. So she says, for Ella Poniatowski Bergelsen and my work featured at the Yiddishland Pavilion were inspired by genealogies and archives of Yiddish anarchism, which sought to work against borders rather than existing beyond borders in the linguistic cultural Bundes sense. I want to think further about how the concept of post-vernacularity might resonate with that approach. Your last remark about the revolutionary usage of the alphabet especially, I want to keep thinking about that. Not a question, but a remark. Okay. So thank you very much, Anna, for this remark. And another question is, I think, is more about Yiddish and Yiddish standards. So can we still consider Litvak Yiddish the gold standard? And is there any standard still?
Oh boy, that's what's so one of the things that makes studying Yiddish so interesting is that this, I would say, the culture of Yiddish speakers going back and to this day, they are not prone to consensus. And if anything, they thrive on dissent. And of course, to have a standard language requires consensus. It also requires an authority, right? That says, this is the official language, I'm in charge, and I'm going to implement it because I control educational institutions or the press or some other, language activities, right? You don't have that apparatus in the Yiddish speaking world, and you have a culture that is that thrives on pushing back against other people's ideas of what is right to shape your own idea of what is right. It's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing, but it's a very distinctive thing, I would argue. And so there is a standard Yiddish per the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, which started to create language standards in interwar Poland and continued in its post-World War II American home in New York. But from the get-go, there has always been resistance. So at the same time that YIVO came up with its standard orthography, spelling, there was another scholar, Noach Prelutsky, who came up with his own standard. And he said, yeah, your standard is very nice if you happen to live in Vilna. That's not where most people live. And I've created a standard that actually reflects more the way most people speak Yiddish. Also, your standard reflects a secular nationalist bias, and mine reflects a religious sensibility. And his standard was used in like the Beis Yankov schools that were these Orthodox girls' schools in Poland. And whereas secular Yiddish schools like the Tzishov schools, they use the YIVO standard. This is going on at the same time. And they're not that different, but the differences were of larger symbolic value, because whenever you talk about language, you're always talking about something else. And that continues to this day. So I would say there are standards. And of course, all languages have some degree of mutual comprehensibility, or else you don't have a language that more than one person knows. But within that, you have something that is much more fluid than you will find in other environments that are just more regulatable and more prone to being regulated.
Thank you. I think that's a great way to conclude today's talk, talking about diversity and this multivocality of Yiddishland. And that's something that in our project we also strive doing. So thank you very much, Jeffrey. It's been an amazing talk. Thank you very much to our audience for all their questions and their attention. Thanks so much again.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, and everyone.
Thank you. Bleiben wir alle gesund.